For most Indians, China just exists as a great blankness. In terms of tea, we think of tea as Indian, don't we? The relationship between India and China has been so much mediated through plants. Tea in the first instance, and then opium, It's a sort of modern way of thinking that places humans absolutely at the center of everything, where all history is just about humans. And in fact, what the story of opium shows us is exactly the opposite. How frail humans are, how fragile human society is, and how easily it can be undone.
Hello everyone. Celebrated author, essayist and anthropologist Amitav Ghosh's new work, Smoke and Ashes, was released last week. We are delighted to have Mr. Ghosh here with us today, who is hopefully going to tell us more about the hidden histories of opium, as he calls it. Welcome, Mr. Ghosh. Wonderful to chat with you.
Thank
Cloudy
you.
Monday morning.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here talking to you, and thank you for having me.
I'll begin with Smoke and Ashes. In the beginning, you mentioned that China was this vast blank space, hovering around India in the maps, and there could be dragons and no one would blink. How relatable this statement is for most of us across generations. We know very little about China, but we are unsurprised about it.
That's right.
But you say that this is not because of a lack of curiosity on our part, but it's because of these barriers that have been created by patterns in global history, as you put it. Could you please elaborate a bit on this for us?
Well, in the first place, I think it is really the case, as you say, that, for most Indians, there's in the first place complete ignorance about China, and a lot of stereotypes, about China, Chinese food, etc. But very little curiosity about the history, about the culture, about all of that. So that Indians are, to a quite astonishing degree, really just ignorant of what exists. This was the case with me,
But why do you think that is so? What are these mental barriers that you are talking about, and how did that get implanted?
Yeah, and I think they exist around the world. I mean, what I'm saying about India is also true of most countries, that China just exists as a great blankness. So I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that in as much as Indians engage with the world, it's almost always in relation to the West,
It's also because in our history textbooks, we don't really read much about China.
We absolutely don't, We read about, British kings and so on. And all of us are unaware that, there was someone called the Qianlong Emperor who was actually one of the most important figures in world history. I mean, he created modern China as it is, in a sense. And he had a deep interest in India. He wrote a book about India, in fact. Yeah. All of this is completely unknown to us, which is a strange thing, I think.
Yeah. And it's only because of tea or something, silk or something, that's the only thing that we talk about when we say China.
We say silk, maybe, but in terms of tea, we think of tea as Indian, don't we?
Yeah. That's also true.
I mean, that's such a strange thing, because tea, of course, came to us from China, and it's absolutely a Chinese thing.
So that brings me to what you say further in the chapter about, you plant this very fascinating thought that plants play a very powerful role, in shaping the culture and history of the world as such. But when you grow up mostly thinking that it's human agency in history, this is a thought that, kind of confuses you, makes you take a step back. Can you expand on this, whether it is tea or opium? How much unlearning you think is required for us to grasp this aspect that plants can play a powerful role?
Yeah, it's a very important, it's a very strange thing, It's a sort of modern way of thinking that places humans absolutely at the center of everything, where all history is just about humans. It really, until quite recently, historians hardly paid attention, to all these other entities that surround us. But, if you read the Mahabharata or the Ramayana, in them you'll see that non-humans play such an enormous role. I mean, the Mahabharata begins with snakes, and snakes play such an important part in the Mahabharata repeatedly, Bhim is saved by the king of snakes, Similarly, plants play such an important part in the Mahabharata. So many flowers appear miraculously, plants appear miraculously. So this is specifically a modern way of thinking where we stop paying attention to all the non-human kinds of entities that surround us. But yet, if you take a step back and think about it, in fact, the relationship between India and China has been so much mediated through plants. Tea in the first instance, and then opium,
So, but this has been mediated by Western powers, that's why.
Yes.
That's probably why, as you say, perhaps this part of history is hidden.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right, because it's a part of a certain colonial history. And also, the struggle against opium, the struggle to sort of limit the production of opium in India, the consumption of opium, etc. The struggle to undo the British opium regime played a very important part in our history, in national history from the 1880s onwards. And I suppose associated with that, there became a kind of stigma attached to this whole history, so that we never learn about it.
Yeah.
We are never told about it, and yet, this plant played an enormously important role.
It's almost the same way like genocides and are hidden in history because of the victor. It's the victor's history.
It's the victor's history. That's right. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
So coming to opium.
Though in this case, I'll say it's not clear who the victor is.
Yes, that's true. But coming to opium itself, which is what the Smoke and Ashes book is about, you said you'd done quite a bit of research, and then you had second thoughts about actually going ahead with the Ibis trilogy and writing the book, because you thought it's a very bleak and unedifying story, as you put it. But then you convinced yourself, because you were convinced about the vitality of Earth. You talk about Earth as something living, breathing, living entity, Is that right?
Yeah, and I think that's now universally accepted. I mean, even by scientists, it's very, very clear that the Earth is, in fact, a living entity that we have to deal with. And the fact that we didn't realize this for such a long time is really a profound indictment of the ways in which we've approached, life on Earth.
In that sense, do you think this is really like a deadly game, between human hubris and what you call as the power and intelligence of poppy, for that matter?
Yeah, absolutely. And the poppy is just one. I mean, there are many, many other entities that are also involved. So that was one of the reasons why I felt it very important to finish the book, even though, in a sense, the subject is so distasteful, because it's really important to recognize two things. One is that, we tell this story, as you say, with humans at the center, and out of that grows a certain idea that humans are omnipotent, that we are all powerful, that we sort of run the earth and so on. And in fact, what the story of opium shows us is exactly the opposite. How frail humans are, how fragile human society is, and how easily it can be undone. So that's one reason why I think it's very important to understand this, because that is the wider story of the global crisis that we are seeing now, the global environmental crisis, which is now, this summer especially, it's become clear that, this is the greatest challenge that we'll ever face. So that was certainly one of the reasons why I felt it very important to write this book. The second reason is that in relation to the opium poppy, more than in most other circumstances, we can see very clearly how this flower just has influenced history and
Greatly,
continues to influence history.
Yeah, in fact, it's very chilling the way your predictions about opium repeating cycles in history is coming true in Manipur, for instance.
Absolutely.
Now, the meaty academics are all claiming that it's because of poppy cultivation in the hills and the chief minister's war on drugs, so-called war on drugs, that's causing the violence.
Yeah, and it absolutely has to be taken into account that in fact all the communities of Manipur are involved in this trade. It's not, this trade is not associated with any one community.
Right.
It's associated with all of them. And I think in this case, you see more clearly than any other the ways in which opium can really undermine all sorts of social structures,
Yeah,
because that's really what it's done. It's completely undermined the state.
correct.
And because opium creates so much money, it brings in huge amounts of armaments. This is happening now in America,
Yes, in Mexico.
In Mexico, the Mexican drug cartels are now, a lot of the, a significant proportion of the arms that have been sent to Ukraine have ended up now in the control of drug cartels,
But then isn't it rather tragic that this, the source of all this violence is still opium in these cases, but still the world is largely unaware of it?
Yes, it's not so much that the world is unaware of it. The world has no way of thinking about it, I think. The world just thinks of criminal networks and so on. It doesn't sort of really recognize the ways in which, this substance inserts itself into society and starts undoing, social structures, because it creates incredible corruption wherever it goes. And this is true of America, it's true of Europe, it's true globally.
Is there any way to break this pattern, this cycle that you talk about, this repetitive cycle of darkness, association of darkness of opium with humanity that you put? Is there any way to break this pattern?
Yes, the pattern was broken. Between 1880s and let's say 1930, 1940, because of the power of of anti-imperialist movements across the globe, really. I mean, Indonesia managed to break that cycle. India also managed to break that cycle, but most of all, China broke it. Very definitely around about 1950.
How did they do that?
Well, in China, from the 1880s onwards, there was a widespread popular movement against opium. Because opium was completely destroying the society, and many women's groups, etc., came together to fight against the opium traffic. And similarly was the case in India, where many women activists and so on joined in the struggle. So it was really just at the level of popular movements. Popular movements came together in order to break this cycle. But I don't think at this point, in relation to opium, that such a movement is going to be possible ever again.
No.
Because unfortunately, the opioid crisis that we are seeing today is occurring in the context of many other crises, We are in a world where we see many intersecting crises, And the environmental crisis is one, which is not just climate change, it's also biodiversity loss, etc. We see, we see today a political crisis, globally, of an unprecedented scale. I mean, who would have thought that, that a fascist party essentially could be voted into power in Italy, as has happened. And I think it's just the beginning. We're going to see far-right parties coming into power across Europe and across America.
And that will again fuel imperialism and the kind of, the opium hegemony, as you put it.
That's right.
Yeah. So when you wrote, The Great Derangement, it was in 2016, you were lamenting that very few fiction writers actually, are tackling this most pressing issue of our times. 7 years almost hence, you think things have changed?
Yes, I do think things have changed. I think a lot more is being written about these subjects now than was the case before. I can tell you that personally, I get like 2 or 3 manuscripts every week. People send me, they write to me saying, your book inspired me to write this book, so now you have to read my book, which unfortunately is not always possible.
Yeah. But you think it's because climate change itself in these past 7 years has become more of a spectacle, and frighteningly so.
Absolutely.
So is that what is,
Absolutely. That's a large part of it.
Yeah.
So it's not just that writers or my book or anything, it's actually the earth is showing us, It's telling us, that this is happening.
Right. But it's also, like everything else now, everything is Instagramized, and climate fiction has also been labeled cli-fi. And do you think it will kind of dissipate into triviality if fiction writers start focusing more on climate change related issues?
I think if they think of writing something called cli-fi, then yes, it will dissipate into triviality. Because what is happening in the world is not about any genre. It's not, it's not fantasy. It's the reality that surrounds us. And I think that's where we have to try and break that cycle and recognize that this is not something exceptional. It's now the reality that we live in, and we have to take this reality into account.
How do you prevent them from making into something sensational? It's because climate change discourse is always either very skeptical or extremely sensational. There is no middle ground yet.
I think that middle ground is emerging. Look, in the first place, let's accept that climate change is sensational. I mean, the things that are happening are completely sensational. I mean, I don't know if you saw in the news day before yesterday, there was a tornado in Milan, which has never happened before. There were these floods near Milan where these streets turned into rivers of hail, massive hailstones like this. I mean, if you got hit by one of them, it would probably kill you, just floating down the streets. And we see this, we see all of this now happening in front of our eyes.
Yes, Uttarakhand, for instance.
But see, this is one thing that we have to pay attention to. It's not just climate change, it's also a lot of other anthropogenic impacts, So in Uttarakhand, of course, there's climate change, but most of all, it's unplanned development of various kinds. You've seen this in Bangalore,
yes,
I mean, Bangalore used to have, 300 lakes or whatever?
Yeah.
They've all been filled in and turned into this. But, water has a memory. Water will come back. And it will come
just
and take those
lakes.
Exactly. In Chennai, we see so clearly, it was just crazy, unplanned development, in areas that had previously been wetlands and so on, So it's very important to recognize that we are making things worse. Instead of trying to adapt to these changes, we are just carrying on as usual.
Finally, I'm just curious to know, you are an anthropologist, and anthropology is, multidisciplinary in nature. So how did you get that impetus to, collect all these different strands like global inequality, trade hegemony, and climate crisis together? Was it anthropological in a sense in your mind? When did you start delving deeply into this climate crisis issue? Was there any trigger as such?
Yeah, I think the trigger for me was when I started doing the research for my book, The Hungry Tide. I spent a lot of time in the Sundarban at that time, and it was already clear then that there were massive impacts. And then over the years, it just grew worse and worse, and now you can see so clearly, what the impacts are in the Sundarban. So that was certainly the beginning of my interest in these issues.
Thank you so much, Amitav
Thank you.
Ghosh.
Thank you.
Wonderful speaking to you.
Thank you so much for having me.